So we have with us, amongst us, pieces of information, approaches which people have done. Inbound and Belting are people who spend their weekend days trying to really come up with new ways of testing that what our ancestors did might actually be what we all think it is, something which can fly, a machine. In China, in the British Museum, in so many places we know of, there is good potential evidence that mankind in the past was contacted. We have sources like Oannes, which says that paleo contact more than likely happened. Nobody from academic establishment is interested. And the story of Oannes has been known since the dawn of science. Nobody cares. But maybe the A of aliens is just too big. Maybe, we're just not ready for it. Maybe we start with something smaller, like Atlantis. Atlantis doesn't involve aliens. It only tells us that there might have been, at one point in the past, a civilization which has disappeared somewhere. That can't be that hard, can it? I mean, it's not that hard. Yeah, maybe. Something like this, something in the middle, of the Atlantic. Athenius Kircher wrote this in the 17th century, produced a map of it. And we have actual written accounts of Atlantis. Solon, the Greek statesman, went to Egypt, came back with a story, which Plato writes down in a book. Written information, something which archaeologists and historians get high on. Plato in his entire career never, ever wrote a piece of fiction. He only wrote history. When he writes about Atlantis, he actually repeats this information to his audience and says, what I'm going to tell you now is history. Do you know what our beloved historians have said that Plato did when he created the story of Atlantis? That he wrote a piece of fiction. That he wrote about an idealized state, that somehow he wasn't happy with the way Athens was run, and he wanted to compare this with a beautiful state which he had invented. And they get away with it. We let the historians get away with it. And if you can do, once again, the thing with the mouse. This is what he writes. For there was a time so long before that great deluge of all, when the city, which now is Athens, was first in war, and was preeminent for the excellence of her laws, and is said to have performed the noblest deeds, and to have had the fairest constitution of any of which tradition tells under the face of heaven. He is reminiscing about a time long gone. Solon marveled at this and earnestly requested the priest in Egypt to inform him exactly and in order about these former citizens, of which the Athenians had no more memory. You're welcome to hear about them, Solon, said the Egyptian priest, both for your own sake and for that of the city, and above all, for the sake of the goddess, Athens, who is the common patron and protector and educator of both our cities. She founded your city 1,000 years before ours, receiving from the earth and her faces the seed of your race. And then she founded ours, the constitution of which is set down in our sacred registers as 8,000 years old. A historical source. Many great and wonderful deeds are recorded of your state in our histories. The Greek state was written down in Egyptian history. But one of them exceeds all the rest in greatness and valor. For these histories tell of a mighty power which was aggression wont only against the whole of Europe and Asia, and to which your city put an end. This power came forth out of the Atlantic Ocean, for in those days the Atlantic was navigable. And there was an island situated in front of the straits, which you call the Pillars of Hercules, i.e. Gibraltar. The island was larger than Libya and Asia put together, and was the way to other islands. And from the islands you might pass through the whole of the opposite continent, which surrounded the true ocean. America. For this sea which is within the straits of Hercules is only a harbour having a narrow entrance. But that other is a real sea, and the surrounding land may be most truly called a continent. Now, in the island of Atlantis, there was a great and wonderful empire, which had ruled over the whole island and several others, as well as over parts of the continent. And besides these, they subjected the parts of Libya within the columns of Heracles, as far as Egypt, and of Europe as far as Tyrrhenia, i.e. Italy. But afterward there occurred violent earthquakes and floods. And in a single day and night of rain, all your warlike men in a body sunk into the earth. And the island of Atlantis in like manner disappeared and was sunk beneath the sea. And that is the reason why the sea in those parts is impassable and impenetrable. Because there is such a quantity of shallow mud in the way, and this was caused by the subsidence of the island. So on to Plato, 500 BC. Give me one example that somehow this story has anything to do with a fictionalized state, which somehow suggests that Athens at one point in the past was bigger. It's one line, that is this single line of a larger account. This is actually a shorter account. The entire account goes into furthermore detail about how all of these things sit within ancient Egyptian history and the rest of history. Because that is what it is. But somehow historians refuse to look at it, even though it meets the criteria of being a written account. And it is really only an account of a lost civilization somewhere in the Atlantic. But maybe we can find it on ourselves. Because Plato actually left detailed accounts of what Atlantis looked like. Detailed measurements. How it looked. He said there were various sections, and then there was a central city, which had ditches of water, and then basically the central aspect. It was largely a plain, and then there were mountains in the background. But before we go there, maybe we can come up with something else, with another historical source. Manetho, an Egyptian priest, high priest of Heliopolis in the 3rd century BC. When Egypt is conquered by the Greeks, there is a great problem, because there are 3 cultures, Jews, ancient Egyptians, and Greeks, who all of a sudden have to live together. Very few of them have any information about the other one's history. So the chief priests, the high priests, are called together and basically asked to write a history of their people. The person chosen to write the account for the ancient Egyptians is Manetho, because he is a high priest of Heliopolis and therefore the expert in such matters. Manetho's account no longer exists as a primary source, but it was written down by two other people, Berosus and Eusebius. Manetho speaks of a king list and basically says several things. The first pharaoh is the first pharaoh of the Egyptian dynasty, roughly 3000 BC, minus. And he says that before that pharaoh, there were 24,925 years of kings who ruled over Egypt. Firstly, he says Egypt was ruled by the gods. Secondly, by the shunned, which means followers of Horus. Finally, by the dynasties of Egypt, beginning with Manetho first. This was confirmed by the likes of Diodorus Siculus, Herodotus, and by archaeological information such as the Turin Papyrus. All of them speak of tens of thousands of years. The Egyptians believed that before this guy, there were tens of thousands of years before, including gods, followers of Horus, and so on. Manetho created a king list. He is the one who basically subdivided Egyptian history into the various dynasties. Archaeologists swear by this king list. Even if they find archaeological evidence which somehow says that somehow this king list might have slight errors in there, and we're talking about 5 years here and 10 years there, they quite often kind of go like, well, we found something, but our dating must be wrong because we found something, you know, like it doesn't conform to the Manetho king list. So what they do is, history of ancient Egypt, this long, they say, this is absolutely accurate. And so people say, well, what do you think about this bit? Oh, well, Manetho invented that, clearly, because we all know that ancient Egypt isn't 25,000 years old. If the Manetho king list was entered into evidence in a court of law, it would be deemed to be inadmissible. In a court of law, you need to have basically the unity of a piece of evidence. You can't just say, well, I like the fact that somebody held this gun, even though we can't prove the fact that the gun ever fired. Can we send this person to jail, please? It's not allowed, for good reasons. But we let the game of science say that the king list of Manetho is at one point completely accurate, and the other half is completely stupid. Well, what does Manetho say? First of all, Manetho is very careful to point out that even though the first kings who he puts in his king list were rulers of Egypt, they actually didn't rule the physical country of Egypt as such, but they ruled the foreign country. And he begins to list them: Ptah, Ra, Su, Set, Osiris, Set, Horus, Ptah, Ma, again Horus. Hence why hereafter they're called the followers of Horus, because Horus basically was the last god to rule Egypt. It is said that Thoth ruled on an island of flame to the west. This dude here, this god here, the ancient Greeks identified with Kronos. There is no debate about this. Everybody accepts that these two match. Plato describes that the Atlanteans were ruled by Kronos, who introduced laws, cities, and agriculture. Poseidon built a palace for Cleito in Atlantis, with whom he had fallen in love. They had 5 sets of twins, for which the eldest was called Atlas, and thus the name of the island or the continent was born. I am not speculating here, I am putting two historical sources next to each other, Plato and Manetho. Manetho says this. We've got one guy there. This is all uncontested. And if you plug him there, then all of a sudden, Manetho is right as well. First kings did not rule Egypt, because these dudes were, according to Plato, ruling somewhere else. Dr. Carlton Kuhn of Harvard is somebody you've never heard of. Who's ever heard of this guy? Yet he is one of the most interesting guys on the planet, because this is what he wrote. The land was said to be foggy. He's talking about Atlantis. The land was said to be foggy and bordered with high mountains, some of which were volcanic. On the side away from the mountains stood an immense lake, and in between lay a network of rivers and irrigation ditches. Towards the mountains rose a dense forest. Many of the trees were conifers sacred to Osiris. The interesting thing about all of this is that nothing in this description resembles Egypt. What Carlton Kuhn is doing is describing a land of Osiris. And all the descriptions which they are given here has nothing to do with Egypt, which is a conclusion he draws. Carlton Kuhn is saying that what the ancient Egyptians were writing about this dude, cannot possibly be Egypt, because the ancient Egyptians clearly knew what they were living in. We've never heard of this guy, yet he's a Harvard professor. Well, in the 1990s, 1991 to be precise, there was a Belgian historian called Marcel Mestac. And Marcel Mestac each year told to his students about how the Vikings came and cruelly slaughtered everybody else in Western Europe, which unfortunately they did. But he also pointed out that what they were doing, the way they were moving about the landscape, seemed to be very intriguing. It was as if they were looking for something. And so he wondered what they were looking for. And he realized that at one point the great Viking army, and we're not talking about a little ship which went into Lindisfarne and unfortunately killed all the monks there. This was the great Viking army, hundreds and thousands of people who marched, invaded England and then France, burning everything in their wake. They did so until they reached one town called Sens, about 150 kilometers southeast of Paris. And they sat in front of Sens and they basically waited until the city surrendered. And he thought that was weird. And afterwards, they didn't continue in their quest. It was as if whatever they were looking for, they had found. Now, if you start looking into the accounts of why the Vikings invaded Western Europe, you will see that science basically speculates. Oh, there might have been overpopulation. Yes, there might, but the evidence suggests there wasn't. Science is unable to give you an answer. Do you know why? Because science is excluding what the Vikings were saying themselves, which was that they were going to seek out the place of Valhalla, the place of the gods. And so when you exclude what is the most likely, if not what the Vikings themselves were doing, you can endlessly speculate at whatsoever. You can waste your career as an academic for 50 years presenting in a vacuum, because we all know, don't we, that the Vikings would never go in search of Valhalla? So Marcel Mestac was intrigued by this. He went to Sens, Cathedral of Sens, and first of all found that Sens, for some reason which nobody has ever been able to explain, was the Archbishopric of France. Not Notre Dame in Paris, not Chartres Cathedral, this one. How many people know that? Very few. The Celtic tribe who was there was known as the Senones, hence the name Sens. Senones means the elders, the old ones. Now, why would they be called the old ones? Clearly because they were more special with the Celts than the other tribes. He came across certain things in Brittany, things like wheels, because this is what historians say, they're wheels. And then you ask historians, well, what is the rest thing? And then they say, we don't know. So he wondered whether this might be a map of something. Could this be parts of Great Britain? Could this be the Rhine? Could this be the Ur, the Alps, the Massif Central of France? And the reason why he began to pose this question was, what he was discovering was, by leaving his town of Ghent and driving around here, he began to realize that what the Vikings were doing was something which they remembered and we had forgotten by the 9th century. The Vikings were using the megaliths of Western Europe to travel about the landscape and making their way to Sam. And when he began to map what the Vikings were doing, he began to realize that there were ditches raised earthworks, massive ones, which sometimes incorporate natural rivers. Over here, near Cambridge, are such massive ditches as well. Vliemdijk is one of them. Historians have no idea why the Vliemdijk, by the way, exists. It is massive, absolutely massive. They have no idea. It's one of the largest ancient structures built on the British Isles. Nobody cares. What Marcel Mest had found here were ditches as well. On places like this oval, 60% remains. If you look at a modern map of France, you will actually see that some of the roads connecting these things, these towns here, actually quite often make these loops because they were built on top of the ditches. Makes sense, doesn't it? Like, hey, why should we make a new world? Why should we make a road somewhere, anywhere, when we have a good foundation and we just put the road on top? 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. He also found that when he mapped the Celtic tribes, the way historians had mapped them, that they mapped perfectly on this system. And the reason is that the Celtic tribes used quite often megaliths as boundary stones, boundary markers. So they were using something which was there to mark their territory. So Marcel Mest called this the megalithic civilization. Megaliths exist across the world, specifically in Western Europe. The most famous ones are in Brittany, around Carnac. But actually when you go to surveys of megalithic monuments which date from the 19th century, before pretty much the modern world destroyed most of them, you will find that the highest concentration of megaliths exists around Sam. There are still hundreds, thousands there, not hundreds of thousands, hundreds and thousands there. And you can still visit them. They're not as pretty as the one here, but there are many of them. More here than there. Slightly less here now than there are there, because here industry has taken over. The megalithic civilization has been known for 200, 300 years as a civilization. Science doesn't care. We call them the megalithic civilization, which basically means to the civilization who built giant stones. Really? Wow, we could not have figured that one out by ourselves. We know nothing about them except the fact that they are people who built giant stones. And nobody cares beyond that point. If you ask somebody whether in Stonehenge, whether Stonehenge might something have to do with Avebury, which sits 20 miles to the north, most academics will tell you that is a comparison which is too far to go to, because basically you're comparing two different structures. Yeah, but they're 20 miles apart. Shouldn't you try to kind of like find out whether they somehow have something to do with them? Why not compare the fact that there are megaliths here, that there are megaliths there, everywhere? Oh no, let's just isolate them. Because when we isolate them, somehow we might think that they're not everywhere. The same. This might not go down well with my colleagues. Colleagues who have since not bothered doing anything. Except one person, Wim Zitman. Wim Zitman is a Dutch architect who, at the age of 50, basically said, I'm going to study Egyptology because what I know, I need to somehow be able to get out there. As a side note, ancient Egyptian chronology is based, the ancient Egyptians have given us dates. But we, Western scientists, cannot apparently understand them. There are roughly 360 dates, and Egyptologists have been able to map 1, potentially 2, with our calendar. These dates have been known for hundreds of years. Nobody cares to map them to our timeline, because they can't. Do you know why? Because the way the Egyptologists put their calendar systems down is not the way we do it. They incorporated astrology, and you need to approach it from an astrological point of view to get the perfect match. You don't even have to believe that astrology is real, you just have to accept that this is the way ancient Egyptians went to work. Egyptologists will never go there. However, WIM did. WIM has been able to map all 360 dates to our calendar. And basically, once you have done 10 or 20 using the proper methodology, you're able to do all the rest. It's simple, it's straightforward. He went to a Berlin professor privately, gave him the results of his discoveries and his findings, and the Berlin professor said, "Great, it's absolutely brilliant. You will never get a single Egyptologist to support you in public. I wish you good luck, but you'll never succeed." So he didn't bother. He just continued on his own, because he knows how to write, he knows how to publish books. And guess what? Because most academic books are so dryly written, actually very few people buy them. So he decided to continue working on his own and continue to write on his own. He became a one-man team to promote what ancient Egypt should stand all about. And if you want to read what he has written, his books are available in English, and one of them is called Ancient Egypt, Image of Heaven, and it's available on things like Amazon and all the rest. However, he has also gone beyond that. At one point he was looking at all of these things. Tiwanaku, the cradle of the Inca civilization. It is said that in Tiwanaku, the god Viracocha appeared out of nowhere and went onto a path down the sacred valley, Cusco, Ollantaytambo, and so on, to bring civilization to the ancestors of the Inca. And then he disappeared again. Teotihuacan, where according to the Mayan tradition, in 3114, the gods convened and decreed a fate for the next 5,000 years, which is running out on December 21st, 2012. The gods convened, they say, right there. Stonehenge, which unfortunately has been slightly misdrawn here. The Great Pyramid. And basically what he did was something which he felt he'd always wanted to do, which was play with maps. Basically he said, like, well, if I draw a line here, a line of longitude, and I flip this around, I end up in a point in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean at a depth where the water is deep, 200 meters deep. It would have been exposed during the last ice age. It would have been above water. And then he connected all the various other places to it. And if you turn yourself around a bit, you get the constellation of Orion, which might explain why over here and over there, the Great Pyramid and its neighbors and the Teotihuacan complex is made out of Orion's belt. According to the creation mythology of these people, Orion's belt is where a non-human intelligence came from, a point of creation, a point where things come down to us, a point of connection. An architect is this, just one man who decided that he was going to find answers to things which nobody else was interested in. And then there are objects like the brown crystal, which have been found in 1968 during a dive of Bimini. When you look at it from certain angles, you see certain pyramids, triangles in there. with these tools, it is really hard to get good photographs, but when you see them, Arthur Fanning has them. People who visit Sedona, and specifically Cottonwood, Arthur Fanning works in a bookshop there, and he is the current person who owns this. It was discovered in the 1968 by a dentist from, if I'm not mistaken, San Diego, called Dr. Ray Brown. Known since the 1960s, nobody cares, even though he said he found this at an underwater structure off the coast of Bimini. But again, nobody seems to take an interest. With all due respect to Arthur, and he'll be the first to agree with me, this object should not be in his possession. He is holding it as a safety because he knows it'll be in his possession and he'll look after it. It's a guardianship. But somebody else should be more interested in it than he is. But no scientist is. In 1924, France, at a site called Glozel. A young farmer who is 16 years old and called Emile Fradin is ploughing a field, and all of a sudden his cart disappears into a hole. And he begins to realize that there's something in that hole, and he begins to pull certain things out, and there are artifacts with inscriptions and depictions and stuff like that. He's a farmer, he's 16 years old, he can hardly write. So he finds out from his father and his family who he should go and find out about, who he should contact. And he contacts a local amateur archaeologist called Dr. Morlaix, who takes an interest in the site, and he begins to map what Emile has been uncovering and encourages Emile to keep digging up, because there's far more about what is in that field than what Emile is finding. And so what happens is that Dr. Morlaix begins to write, and science becomes interested. And at one point, science thinks that maybe this is dangerous. Morlaix might have found something which is going to upset the paradigm. History books might have to be rewritten. That can't happen. So first of all, they try to take control. They go to him and say, Dr. Morlaix, you're a very intelligent man. I can offer you publication in scientific journals, except my name, not my name, but academic in the 1920s, needs to go in front of yours. And Dr. Morlaix says no, because Dr. Morlaix knew what the academics were going to do. So he says, no, not interested, sorry, bye-bye now. But it continues. There is a scientific conference in Amsterdam, and the rumors are very much like a scientific conference in Malta a few years ago, where the likes of Anthony Harding need to say something about the Bosnian pyramids. Well, in Amsterdam in the 1920s, somebody needs to say something about Glozel. And they try to get control by sending a mission to there and say, like, we will confirm or find out what the truth is about these things. And they come, they see, and the majority of the people at that scientific mission conclude that Glozel is real. However, when the final report is written down, the final report says that it is not real. At this moment in time, Dr. Morlaix doesn't want to go away. And Dr. Morlaix basically does something which upsets them greatly. They know he will not die. He's too young to die. They can't kill him, or they can kill him, but it would probably be too obvious or too far-fetched. And they realize that there is a small museum which shows some of these artifacts which Dr. Morlaix is recovering. And there's a small exhibition for which you have to pay the equivalent of €1 to get in. And they decide to go there with a lawyer to basically say, this is all a hoax, you are extorting money well, you should know better. They make a complaint with the police. They throw Émile Fradin in jail. And science had won, because for the rest of history, they have said that Émile Fradin was arrested, even though he was set free and completely vindicated by the law. For the last 50, 60, 70 years, every single archaeologist and historian who talks about Glozel will say it is a fake because Fradin was arrested on charges of forgery and hoax. This is why the commission convened in Amsterdam was at Glozel. Dr. Mollet is pointing a finger. I think Da Vinci did it as well at some point with some of his paintings. It's an accusing finger. And he's pointing to somebody who's sort of hidden behind here. And it's a woman called Dorothy Garrow. She's an Oxford professor of archaeology. And what happened was that when the commission came on the third day, the trenches, the site where the archaeology was happening had not yet been officially opened by Dr. Mollet, who had the key. Yet somehow he finds this group of scientists already in sight. And he sees them poking with their fingers and things like that. He's a very clever man. He knows what's going on. And so he rushes in, catches them red-handed, and is accusing them all of trying to basically spoil the site because they couldn't find any evidence whatsoever that the site was a hoax. So they were going to hoax it themselves. And Mollet is furious, accusing them all that this is happening. All the parties involved have left testimony saying that this was indeed the accusation Mollet made. I'm not making this up. The chief one he accused was Dorothy Garrow, who has never denied this incident, because she can't. There are so many witnesses. There's photographic evidence. I'm showing you the photograph. So I wrote an article about this for Nexus magazine. It appeared in some of the translated editions of Nexus magazine. And I have like a Google alert with my name in, so I can always see whether somebody's writing something about me. And at one point, I see that Bad Archaeology has put my name in with the article I've written for Nexus on the Glozel affair. And I thought, that's great. Bad Archaeology is going to really use my article as an example of how bad archaeology was done by the likes of Dorothy Garrow and everybody else. By the way, Dorothy Garrow, who Oxford remains the one centre where everything about the Glozel exhibition still goes through. They continue to say it is a fake. Even today, Oxford professors ask it, they'll say it's a fake. Even though she was caught red-handed. Unfortunately, Bad Archaeology was not so pleasantly inclined towards my article. The chief guy behind Bad Archaeology is a guy called Doug Weller, who people who have gone to the Bosnian entry on Wikipedia might know as the guy who is constantly with his fingers in the pie there, who's constantly doing things there. If you go to Wikipedia, please go to the Bosnian website there and click on the tab which says Talk and read how Mr. Weller does his archaeology. It's bad. But that's not why he calls his website Bad Archaeology. It's not self-reflective, it's accusatory. So he is doing something about the Glozel affair and basically accuses me of misrepresenting the facts. Because he says that I did horrible things to this poor woman, Dorothy Garrow, because I left out what, in his opinion, exonerates her. Because Garrow a few years after this had happened, wrote in a book that she wasn't there to spoil the site, that she decided to go in there early to make sure that they could get an unobstructed view of everything which was going on. Whereas everybody else says she was spoiling the site. So, by the rules of science, I propose that we do something with the Justice Department in every country from now onwards. Anybody who's accused of murder, if that person says, I didn't do it, we set him free. We give him an academic degree, we do whatever we want with him, because this is apparently the way science pretends to work. Is it criminal? Yes. Is it dying? Yes. Because we are beginning to see what it is like. We can ourselves, the likes of Wim Zitman, the likes of me, we can go to read Plato, we can read Manetho, and we can see verifiable historical documents and read them ourselves. Fortunately, things like Ancient Aliens have realized that people like us are completely pissed off with a Robert Glozel on one side who says something and a Zahi Hawass, or heaven forbid Ken Lehner, on the other side who says something completely differently and leaves the general audience wondering, what the heck did we just see now? We should be watching Muhammad Ali versus somebody else because it's a better thing to watch than what we're seeing here once again on our television. It is slowly happening, but it'll take a few more years. So in the meantime, let us do what we can. And I come from Belgium, and the Belgian Revolution happened in 1830, when, I don't know how many seats there are, but let's say, I know there are not 500 seats, but let's pretend there are 500 seats here. In 1830 in Belgium, there was a play, and people left the theatre so utterly disgusted with the oppression of the Dutch authorities that they decided to rebel, 250 of them. And within 24 hours, Belgium was free. It took 250 people. We can make a difference. We do not, Doc Weller is one guy. They hide in the bushes, they hide on the internet, they hide everywhere. You do not have to let them get away with it. Speak out, simply, by promoting what you have seen here, by doing little things, like going to Facebook and liking Sam's page. Get that up there. If you spend 1 hour every month going on Facebook and see what's out there, share like Sam, because you've been here, you are here, you have seen what is here. Go to other things which takes your interest, whether they are aliens, Atlantis, anything, pyramids, anything. Help spread the world. Become a mass which says, no, science, you are there to help us. In the movie V for Vendetta, it says, politicians should be afraid of the people shouldn't be afraid of the politicians. We should do the same with science. They are living on our money. They are there to serve us. They shouldn't be lying to us, they shouldn't be withholding evidence. When it comes to things like life after death, science actually even says that they don't need to study this. They have decided that this is not part of the game they want to play. So even though there are billions of people out there who want to find out whether there is life after death, science has said, sorry, not interested. Thank you, bye-bye. Before thanking and me going bye-bye, if you want to read more about me, there are 2 books. The Ancient Alien Question and Lost Civilization Enigma, which is coming out. If you want to follow me, you can go to Twitter or Facebook or read hundreds of articles on my website. There is a common theme there, which basically tells you let them not get away with it. And I would thank you all for being here and showing specifically Sam what he's been doing for the last 6 years now, which is continuing along the way and which is really remarkable. And despite the fact that there is an entire archaeological establishment out there, thousands of people, one man does not want to go away. And that is remarkable. That is democracy at work. And that is something which is an example for the future to come as to how hidden history will soon become unveiled. Thank you.